My name is Eric Robsky-Huntley. My research focuses on using mapping and spatial data science to support movements for social justice, particularly around housing. And I'm explaining one of our racially just research themes, positionality. Positionality basically describes the relationship between the researcher and the researched, particularly as it relates to their relative position along various axes of exclusion, for example, race, class, gender. In other words, who is the researcher to the researched, and vice versa. Questions of positionality are generally traced back to arguments in feminist studies of science that emerged in the 1980s around what is variously called standpoint epistemology or situated knowledge. Much of this comes down to a critique of Western scientific practice, which asserts that to do objective research, the researcher must suppress their identity and experiences, because these would bias the results. This raises a thorny question, though. Is it actually possible for a researcher to be fully objective and to separate themselves from their experiences and identities? Critics have come at that question from many, many angles, but we can take this one for starters. Does it work? Does it actually make research more objective when the researcher asserts their absence? Many, in fact, have argued the opposite, that by foregrounding and acknowledging their social position, researchers become more, not less, objective. Furthermore, scholars have argued that disinterest itself reflects a form of epistemic privilege that's available only to those in dominant social groups. To do research from a position on the margins is to do research that's interested in changing, not disinterestedly analyzing the world. The place of positionality is currently kind of a live question in anti-racist research, partially because of its association with identity politics. The Combahee River Collective, a Boston-based black feminist organization, coined the term in the 1970s. Identity politics described how they thought of their work as black women, which, in their analysis, gave them a perspective on how racialized and gendered forms of oppression intersect. Today, identity politics is sometimes associated with a way of claiming authority. Some have begun to make the case that this form of argument does a couple of troubling things. First, it places the burden of advocating for political change on minoritized people. Two, it selectively elevates marginal categories in order to make arguments that can actually just advance the interest of dominant groups. And three, it gives folks in dominant positions an out, which is to say, I can't possibly understand the experience of oppressed people, therefore I defer. I research property ownership and aspire to hold the housing industry to account for the precarious situation of particularly renters. I occupy in many ways a dominant social position. I'm a white kid turned white adult from an upper middle class family who teaches at an elite institution, and though I'm non binary, I read as a man in many contexts. On the other hand, I'm a renter, and am therefore in a subordinate position to, at the very least, my landlord and landlords as a structural category. For me, this position implies that I should take on the institutions in society that actually hold quite a lot more power than even many relatively privileged researchers. Racialized housing insecurity can't be understood without reference to who owns land and who owns property. To summarize, positionality is important in the context of anti-racist research for at least two reasons. First, foregrounding positionality yields better research, arguably, that's more cognizant of the limitations placed on it and the affordances that are there for it because of the experiences of the researcher. Second, positionality is one way into an analysis of power that suggests where the researcher is actually best positioned to intervene.